My daughter got suspended for breaking a bully's nose after he threatened her friend, so I refused to accept the punishment and kept her home until the school actually investigated what really happened. I, 37F, am a single mom to my son Tommy, who just turned 10. I need to get this out because the school is making me question if I'm completely out of line here, but everything in me says I'm not. My ex-husband Ronald and I split up about 3 years ago. The divorce wasn't messy in the legal sense, but it gutted our family. He'd been having an affair with someone from his gym, a woman half his age. When I found out, he didn't even try to fix things, just packed his bags and moved in with her. Within 6 months, he'd relocated to California for a job opportunity, leaving me and Tommy behind in Ohio. He sends child support on time, I'll give him that, but he calls maybe once a month. Tommy stopped asking about him after the first year. Being a single parent was hard enough, but then something happened last winter that changed everything. I work as a database administrator for a mid-sized company, and my hours are usually 9 to 5. One evening in February, I was walking from the bus stop to our apartment. It was already dark. A guy came up from behind and grabbed my purse. I didn't let go right away, which was stupid in hindsight. He shoved me hard onto the pavement and kicked me twice before running off with my bag. I ended up with a fractured wrist, bruised ribs, and my face looked like I'd gone a few rounds in a boxing ring. My mom came to stay with us for 2 weeks while I recovered. Tommy saw me like that. He saw me struggling to open a jar because my wrist was in a cast. He saw me wince every time I moved wrong. He heard me on the phone with the police, describing the attack over and over. After my mom went home, Tommy started following me around the apartment. He'd wait outside the bathroom door. If I went to take out the trash, he'd insist on coming with me. At night, he'd wake up and come check that I was still in my room. His teacher called me in April to say he seemed distracted and asked if everything was okay at home. I explained what had happened. The school counselor talked to Tommy a few times. She said he was processing trauma, and it would take time. She suggested I look into getting him proper counseling, but our insurance has a high deductible, and the copays were going to be expensive. I put our names on a sliding scale clinic's waitlist. They told me it might be 4 to 6 months before they had an opening. Around that same time, my coworker Janet mentioned that her daughter had been having confidence issues after some girls at school excluded her from everything. She'd enrolled her in a Brazilian jiu-jitsu class at a local gym, and it had really helped, not just physically, but mentally. Her daughter had made friends there and seemed more sure of herself. I brought it up to Tommy one evening while we were having dinner. I asked if he'd be interested in trying something like martial arts. He looked at me for a long minute, then said he'd only do it if I did it too. He didn't want to go somewhere without. So I called the gym and explained our situation to the instructor, a guy named Rick who ran the kids program. I told him about the mugging and about Tommy's separation issues. Rick said I could sit in on the beginner kids class, even though I was obviously an adult. The class was small anyway, just 6 kids including Tommy. We started going twice a week in May. Tommy took to it faster than I expected. Rick was patient and good with the kids. The other children were welcoming. By June, Tommy was keeping up with kids who'd been training for 6 months. He'd practiced the moves at home, showing me what he'd learned. Meanwhile, I was still struggling with the basic techniques in the kids' class, feeling slightly ridiculous as a 37-year-old woman learning to grapevine alongside 9 and 10-year-olds. In July, Rick moved Tommy up to the intermediate kids' class, which met right after the adult beginner class, so I switched to the adult class and kept going. It felt good to be doing something physical, and I'd made a couple of friends there too. The shift in Tommy was noticeable. He wasn't as clingy anymore. He started sleeping through the night again, but something new developed. When we'd be out walking and someone would approach us, even just a random person on the sidewalk, Tommy would position himself between me and them. If we were in a store and someone got too close, he'd step in front of me. I kept telling him that I was the parent, that it was my job to protect him, not the other way around. He'd nod, but the behavior continues. School started back up in late August. Tommy's in 4th grade now. During the first week, a new kid joined his class. The kid's name is Carter. Tommy came home that first day talking nonstop about Carter. How Carter had this wild curly hair that he wore in a ponytail. How Carter wore bright yellow sneakers with his uniform. How Carter knew everything about dinosaurs and space and could draw really well. They became inseparable within days. Every afternoon, Tommy would tell me what he and Carter had done at recess, what Carter had said at lunch, what drawing Carter had made in art class. I was relieved to see Tommy connecting with someone. He'd been fairly isolated since the divorce, and especially since the mugging. I met Carter's parents at the school's open house night the second week of September. His mom is named Beth, and his dad is Jacob. They were warm and friendly. Beth worked as a paralegal, and Jacob was a high school history teacher. We exchanged phone numbers and agreed to arrange a play date. Tommy told me on a Tuesday that Carter had painted his nails over the weekend. He showed me a photo Carter had taken. These bright orange nails. Carter had told the class about it during show and tell. Some of the boys had laughed. Carter had apparently told them his older sister had painted them, and he liked how they looked. So what? The next day, Wednesday, Tommy came home and said some boys in class were being mean to Carter, calling him names, saying boys shouldn't paint their nails or wear their hair long or any of that stuff. Tommy said he'd told them to shut up and leave Carter alone. So had another kid in class, a girl named Zoe. On Thursday, Tommy came home and went straight to his room. I gave him some space, then knocked and asked if he wanted to talk. He said the boys had been worse that day. They'd cornered Carter at recess and said that boys who do girl things are freaks. One of the boys, A kid named Ethan had told Carter that if he came to school on Friday with his nails painted again, Ethan was going to beat him up. I asked Tommy if he'd told a teacher. He said no. I asked why not. He said he and Carter wanted to handle it themselves. I sat down and had a long talk with him about how serious threats are and how teachers need to know when someone's being bullied. Tommy just kept saying that telling adults doesn't always fix things. He said Carter didn't want to tell his parents because they'd already dealt with this at his old school, and that's why they'd moved districts. Carter was tired of being the kid who needed protecting. I didn't know what to make of this. Part of me understood Tommy's point. Part of me thought he was too young to be making these judgment calls. I told him he needed to tell a teacher if anything else happened. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really agreeing. Friday morning, Tommy left for school like normal. I went to work. At 1 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was the school secretary, asking me to come pick up Tommy immediately. He'd been involved in a fight and was being suspended pending an investigation. My stomach dropped. I left work and drove to the school. When I got there, I was directed to the front office. Tommy was sitting in a chair, staring at the floor. His knuckles were scraped. There was dirt on his uniform pants. Across the room, Carter was sitting with his dad, Jacob, who must have come straight from the high school where he taught. Carter was crying. Jacob had his arm around him. The principal, Mr. Hendricks, came out and asked me to step into his office. He told me Tommy had attacked another student without provocation during lunch recess. The other boy, Ethan, had a bloody nose and possibly a broken tooth. Mr. Hendricks said this kind of violence was completely unacceptable, and Tommy was suspended for the rest of the week while they investigated. I asked what Tommy had said happened. Mr. Hendricks said Tommy claimed he was defending Carter, but that Ethan's version was that Tommy had just jumped him out of nowhere. Mr. Hendricks said he was inclined to believe Ethan because Tommy was the one who'd caused all the injuries. I asked if he'd spoken to Carter. He said Carter was too upset to give a coherent statement. I asked if he'd spoken to any other students who'd witnessed it. He said not yet, but he would. I asked if Ethan had been threatening Carter all week. Mr. Hendricks looked surprised. He said this was the first he'd heard of any threat. I told him Tommy had come home on Thursday and told me about Ethan's threat. Mr. Hendricks wrote something down and said he'd look into it. When we left, Jacob caught up with me in the parking lot. He said Carter had told him everything in the car on the way over. Ethan had been bullying Carter all week. On Friday, Carter had shown up with his nails painted bright blue, specifically because he wasn't going to let Ethan dictate what he could or couldn't do. At lunch, Ethan had started walking toward Carter with 3 other boys. Tommy had stepped between them. Ethan had shoved Tommy and told him to move. Tommy had shoved back. Then Ethan had taken a swing at Tommy, missed, and Tommy had punched him in the face. Jacob said Carter told him he'd reported the bullying to their homeroom teacher, Mrs. Patterson, after the Tuesday incident. Mrs. Patterson had apparently told Carter that boys tease each other and he needed to develop thicker skin. When Carter mentioned the Thursday threat, she'd said she'd talk to Ethan, but Carter never saw that happen. I went home with Tommy and asked him to tell me exactly what happened. His version matched what Jacob had told. I asked why he'd punched Ethan. He said Ethan came at him first and he reacted. He'd been standing on the ledge of the planter box where they were sitting, and when Ethan swung, Tommy had punched down and Ethan's nose had started bleeding everywhere. I asked if he'd tried to tell the lunch supervisor what had been going on. He said yes, after the fight. But the supervisor had only seen Tommy on top of Ethan and assumed Tommy was the aggressor. The supervisor hadn't listened when Tommy tried to explain. That weekend, I couldn't stop going over it. Beth called me Saturday afternoon. She and Jacob wanted to meet up and talk about what to do. We met for coffee Sunday morning while the kids played at the park nearby. Beth told me Carter had been dealing with this since kindergarten. He'd always been expressive, always liked bright colors and art and things that other kids labeled as feminine. Their previous school district had been worse. One teacher had actually called them in to suggest Carter might need behavioral assessment. They'd switched districts hoping for a better environment. Jacob said they'd already decided to push back on the suspension. Carter hadn't thrown a punch. He'd been the victim of targeted harassment all week. The school had failed to protect him even after he'd reported it. They weren't going to let Tommy take the fall for standing up when the school wouldn't. We agreed to go into the meeting together on Monday. Monday morning at 8, I walked into Mr. Hendricks' office. Jacob and Beth were already there. Mr. Hendricks looked surprised to see them. He started by going over Tommy's suspension. He said the investigation had confirmed that Tommy had broken Ethan's nose and chipped his tooth. He said regardless of the circumstances, the school had a zero-tolerance policy on violence. Tommy would be suspended for a full week and would need to complete a behavior intervention program before returning. He also said Tommy would need to apologize to Ethan. Before I could say anything, Beth spoke up. She asked Mr. Hendricks if he'd investigated the death threat Ethan had made against her son. Mr. Hendricks hesitated. He said he'd spoken to Ethan, who denied making any threats. He'd also spoken to Mrs. Patterson, who said she didn't recall Carter reporting any bullying. Jacob asked if he'd spoken to Zoe, the other student who'd witnessed the incidents. Mr. Hendricks said he hadn't gotten to that yet. Beth asked why her son was being left out of the zero-tolerance policy. If the school didn't tolerate violence, why were they tolerating threats of violence against Carter? And why were they punishing the only student who'd actually protected Carter when the school had failed to? Mr. Hendricks said he understood their frustration, but that didn't change the fact that Tommy had physically assaulted another student. The injury was serious. He couldn't overlook that. I asked him how he'd completed an investigation without interviewing my son, without interviewing Carter, and without interviewing witnesses. He said he'd interviewed the victim. I pointed out that the victim was also the aggressor, which made his statement unreliable. Mr. Hendricks said his hands were tied by district policy. Beth asked to see the anti-bullying policy. Mr. Hendricks pulled it up. Beth went through it line by line. The policy clearly stated that threats of violence were grounds for immediate disciplinary action. She asked why that hadn't been applied to Ethan. Mr. Hendricks said there was no proof Ethan had made threats. Jacob pulled out his phone and showed Mr. Hendricks the text Carter had sent him Thursday night, the one where Carter told his dad about Ethan's threat to beat him up. He'd screenshotted it that night. Mr. Hendricks looked at it and said he'd need to reopen the investigation. Beth said that wasn't good enough. She wanted to know why Mrs. Patterson had dismissed Carter's report and why the school's first instinct had been to punish the victim's friend instead of investigating the bullying. The meeting went in circles for another 20 minutes. Finally, I told Mr. Hendricks that I wasn't accepting the suspension as it stood. I'd be keeping Tommy home until the school dealt with this properly, but I wouldn't be treating it as a disciplinary suspension. I'd be treating it as me removing my son from an unsafe environment. I emailed Tommy's teacher for his assignments. I arranged to work from home the rest of the week, and I waited. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since I posted originally. I've gotten a lot of messages asking what happened, so here's the update. After I walked out of that meeting, Beth stayed. I didn't know this at the time. She told me about it later when we met up that following Saturday. Apparently, after Jacob and I left, she closed the office door and told Mr. Hendricks they needed to finish the conversation. She kept him in that office for another 90 minutes. She went through the school's anti-bullying policy point by point and made him explain how his actions aligned with each section. She asked him to walk her through the reporting procedure and explain where it had broken down. She asked him why Mrs. Patterson was still in the classroom if she'd actively ignored a bullying report. Mr. Hendricks kept trying to redirect, saying he'd launch a full investigation into staff procedures. Beth told him she didn't want an investigation into staff. She wanted accountability. She wanted to know why the only person being punished was her son's friend, the only person who'd actually done something. When Mr. Hendricks brought up the zero tolerance policy again, Beth asked why it was being selectively applied. If they had zero tolerance for violence, why wasn't Ethan being suspended for making violent threats? And if they weren't going to enforce it against Ethan, then they couldn't enforce it against Tommy. Beth said Mr. Hendricks got defensive at that point. He said she was putting him in an impossible position. The injury to Ethan was documented and serious. Parents were calling asking why the school was allowing fights. He had to be seen taking action. Beth told him the action he should be taking was protecting kids like Carter from bullies like Ethan. And if he couldn't do that, then maybe he wasn't the right person for the job. She left without getting a firm answer. That same afternoon, I got a call from the assistant principal, Mrs. Kelly. She asked if I could come in Tuesday morning for a follow-up meeting. I asked if Mr. Hendricks would be there. She said no, he was out dealing with another matter. I agreed. Tuesday morning, I met with Mrs. Kelly. She was more reasonable than Mr. Hendricks had been. She started by acknowledging that the school had mishandled the situation. She said they'd now interviewed Zoe and 2 other students who'd witnessed the week's events. All of them confirmed that Ethan and his friends had been harassing Carter. All of them had heard Ethan make threats. Mrs. Kelly said they'd also reviewed security camera footage from the lunch area. The footage showed Tommy standing near Carter when Ethan approached. It showed Ethan shove Tommy first. The punch itself wasn't clearly visible because of the angle, but the sequence of events supported Tommy's account. She said Tommy's suspension would be reduced. He'd be allowed back Thursday. There would be no behavior intervention program and no forced apology. I asked what was happening with Ethan. Mrs. Kelly said she couldn't discuss another student's discipline. I said that was fine, but I'd be watching closely to make sure Carter was safe. She assured me they were taking steps. I didn't push further. Tommy went back to school Thursday. He said Ethan wasn't in class. Carter told him Ethan had been moved to a different homeroom. I don't know if that was a disciplinary thing or if Ethan's parents requested it, but either way, they weren't in the same room anymore. Things seemed okay for about a week. Tommy and Carter were back to being inseparable. Tommy came home happy. Carter's parents and I had become actual friends at this point, bonding over the shared experience of fighting the school administration. Then 2 weeks ago, I got a call from Mrs. Patterson, Tommy's homeroom teacher. She asked if I could come in for a conference. I asked what it was about. She said she wanted to discuss Tommy's behavior in class. I went in the next day during my lunch break. Mrs. Patterson started by saying she was concerned about Tommy. She said he'd been aggressively protective of Carter in class. If anyone said anything even mildly critical to or about Carter, Tommy would immediately jump in. She said it was creating tension in the classroom. I asked for an example. She said that during a group project last week, one of the kids had suggested a different approach to something Carter wanted to do. Tommy had told the kid to back off and leave Carter alone. The kid wasn't even being mean, just offering a different idea. I asked if she'd spoken to Tommy about it. She said she had, but he'd been dismissive. She was worried Tommy was being overprotective to the point where it was affecting Carter's ability to navigate normal social interactions. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me saw her point. Part of me was still furious at her for ignoring Carter's initial reports of bullying. I told her I'd talk to Tommy. She said she appreciated it. As I was leaving, she stopped me and said she wanted to apologize. She said she'd mishandled the situation with Carter and she regretted not taking his concerns seriously from the start. I nodded and left. That evening, I sat down with Tommy. I asked him about what Mrs. Patterson had said. He got defensive immediately. He said kids still whisper about Carter. they still make comments. He doesn't trust them. I told him I understood why he felt protective, but that Carter needed space to handle things on his own sometimes. Tommy said Carter shouldn't have to handle anything. People should just leave him alone. I said yes. Ideally. But we don't live in an ideal world. Carter needs to learn to stand up for himself, and Tommy constantly stepping in might actually make that harder. Tommy went quiet. Then he said he didn't know how to turn it off. After everything with me, after the mugging, he'd felt helpless. Training had helped him feel less helpless. And now with Carter, he finally felt like he could actually protect someone. He didn't want to stop. I didn't have a good answer for that. Last week, Beth called me in the eve. She said Carter had come home upset. He and Tommy had gotten into an argument at school. Carter had told Tommy to back off because he was making things worse. Tommy had said he was just trying to help. Carter had said he didn't need Tommy's help with every little thing. They hadn't spoken for 2 days after that. Beth said Carter loved having Tommy as a friend, but he was starting to feel suffocated. Every time someone looked at him wrong, Tommy was there. Carter told his mom he felt like Tommy didn't think he could handle anything by himself. I talked to Tommy about it that night. He said Carter didn't understand. He said the other kids would hurt Carter if Tommy wasn't watching out for him. I asked if Carter had said that. Tommy admitted no, but he knew it was true. I asked how he knew. He couldn't give me an answer. On Saturday, Jacob called and asked if I wanted to bring Tommy over. He said Carter wanted to talk to Tommy but was nervous about it. I said yes. We went over Saturday afternoon. The boys went up to Carter's room while the adults stayed in the kitchen. After about 30 minutes, they came back down. Carter had clearly been crying. Tommy looked uncomfortable. Carter told us that he'd explained to Tommy that he needed space. He said Tommy was his best friend, and he didn't want that to change. But he needed Tommy to trust him to handle his own problems sometimes. Tommy said he understood. He said he'd try to back off. On the drive home, Tommy was quiet. When we got home, he went to his room. I let him be for a while, then knocked. He said he didn't know how to be Carter's friend without protecting him. That's what friends do, right? They protect each other. I said yes, but there's a difference between protection and control. Friends also trust each other. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. This week at school, things have been tense according to Tom. He's trying to give Carter space, but it feels wrong to him. He said Wednesday at lunch, some kid made a comment about Carter's hair, and Tommy almost said something but stopped himself. Carter handled it on his own, told the kid his opinion wasn't asked for, and it was fine. But Tommy said he'd stood there the whole time with his fists clenched, ready to step in if needed. I don't know how to help him find balance, and honestly, I'm not sure this is something I can fix. Part of me wonders if the training was a mistake. It gave him tools, but maybe it also gave him too much responsibility too soon. Update 2. It's been over a month since my last post. A lot has happened, and not all of it good. Tommy and Carter's friendship got rockier before it got better. For about 2 weeks after that conversation at Carter's house, Tommy was clearly struggling. He'd come home from school and barely say anything. When I asked how his day was, he'd just shrug. Beth texted me during that time to say Carter was also having a hard time. He missed how things used to be with Tommy, but didn't know how to bridge the gap. Then something happened that shifted everything again. A kid in their class, a boy named Tyler, got sick during PE, started having trouble breathing. Turned out he was having an asthma attack and didn't have his inhaler with him. The teacher sent someone to the office to get the nurse while she stayed with Tyler. Tommy apparently didn't wait. He ran to the office himself, which was faster. He got the nurse, who brought Tyler's emergency inhaler. Tyler was fine. The nurse told me later when I picked Tommy up that day that Tommy might have actually helped speed things up. Carter told his parents that night that watching Tommy take charge reminded him why they'd become friends in the first place. Tommy didn't hesitate. He just acted. The next day, Carter approached Tommy at lunch and apologized. He said he'd been wrong to make Tommy feel bad about wanting to help people. He just didn't want to be treated like he couldn't do anything by himself. Tommy apologized too. He said he knew he'd been overbearing. They agreed to figure it out together. Things got easier after that. But then last month, something else happened that I didn't see coming. Ethan, the kid from the original fight, was apparently struggling. According to what I pieced together from various sources, he'd been suspended for a week after the investigation. When he came back, he was moved to a different homeroom, like I mentioned before. But kids still knew what had happened. His friends had distanced themselves. His parents enrolled him in counseling. I know this because Ethan's mom, Jennifer, called me out of the blue 3 weeks ago. She said she wanted to apologize. She said she hadn't known the full story when everything happened. Ethan had told her he'd been attacked unprovoked. She'd believed, but in counseling, Ethan had eventually admitted to his part in bullying Carter and to throwing the first punch. Jennifer said she'd been horrified. She and her husband had thought they were raising their son right, but clearly something had gone wrong. She wanted to apologize to both me and to Carter's family for what Ethan had put everyone through. I didn't know what to say. I appreciated the call, but I also wasn't sure what she expected from me. I told her I accepted her apology. She asked if there was any way the boys could reconcile. She thought it might help Ethan to make amends. I said I'd have to think about it and talk to Tommy. When I brought it up to Tommy, he immediately said no. He said he didn't trust Ethan and didn't want to be around him. I said I understood, and I wasn't going to force anything. I texted Beth to let her know about the call. She said Jennifer had reached out to them too. Carter had also said no to meeting up. 2 weeks ago, the school had a fall carnival fundraiser. Tommy wanted to go because Carter was going. I drove them both there and stayed to help at one of the booths. About an hour into the event, I saw Ethan arrive with his parents. Ethan saw Carter and Tommy and walked over. I was close enough to hear. Ethan said he wanted to apologize. Carter and Tommy both just stared at. Ethan said he'd been a jerk. He said he was sorry for what he'd said and done. He said he knew they probably wouldn't forgive, but he wanted them to know he was working on being better. Carter said okay. Tommy didn't say anything. Ethan walked away. Later, on the drive home, Carter said he thought Ethan seemed genuine. Tommy said he didn't care. Carter asked Tommy if he'd ever be able to forgive Ethan. Tommy said probably not. Last week, Mrs. Kelly, the assistant principal, called me in for another meeting. I went in Wednesday after work. She said she wanted to update me on how things were going with Tommy in school. She said his grades were good. His behavior was mostly fine, but she'd noticed he was isolating himself. He only ever spent time with Carter. He didn't participate in group activities if he could avoid it. In class, he was quiet and withdrawn unless Carter was involved in the discussion. She asked if things were okay at home. I said yes, as far as I knew. She suggested maybe Tommy could benefit from talking to someone. She mentioned the school counselor again. I said I'd think about it. When I talked to Tommy about it, he said he didn't see the point. He said he was fine. He had Carter. He didn't need other friends. I tried to explain that it's good to have more than one friend, but he shut down the conversation. Rick, the jiu-jitsu instructor, pulled me aside after class last Thursday. He said he'd noticed a change in Tommy too. Tommy used to be engaged and focused during training. Lately, he'd seemed somewhere else. Rick asked if everything was all right. I told him about the fight at school and everything that had followed. Rick nodded. He said sometimes kids who go through what Tommy went through, both with me and with standing up for Carter, come out of it with a different relationship to fighting. He said some kids start seeing it as the answer to everything. Others swing the opposite direction and lose interest in training altogether. He said he'd keep an eye on Tommy and make sure he was in the right headspace. On Sunday, Carter's family invited us over for dinner. While the adults were in the kitchen, the boys were in the living room playing video games. At some point, they started arguing. We couldn't hear what it was about, but their voices got loud. Jacob went to check on them. He came back and said they'd gotten into it over something in the game, but they'd worked it out. After dinner, on the drive home, I asked Tommy what the argument had been about. He said Carter had accused him of letting him win. Tommy said he hadn't been. Carter said Tommy clearly wasn't trying as hard as he usually did. Tommy said he'd been trying, but maybe he just wasn't into it. I asked what he meant. He said he didn't know. He said lately everything felt like too much effort. That scared me. I asked if he'd been feeling like that a lot. He said sometimes. I made an appointment with our regular doctor for this week. I want to make sure nothing medical is going on, and I'm seriously considering the school counselor now, even though I'd been avoiding it because of money. Tommy's been through a lot in the past year, maybe more than I realized. Update 3. It's been 2 months since I last posted. This will probably be my final update because things have mostly settled, though not in the way I expected. After that last post, I took Tommy to our doctor. She ran some basic tests and everything came back normal physically. She spent a long time talking to Tommy alone. When she called me back in, she said she thought Tommy was dealing with more than just stress from the school situation. She used the word depression. She referred us to a pediatric psychiatrist. The wait list was 3 months out. I called every day for 2 weeks asking about cancellations until finally someone had an opening. The psychiatrist met with Tommy for an hour, then talked to me. She said Tommy showed signs of anxiety and depression, likely stemming from the mugging and compounded by the stress of the situation with Carter and Ethan. She didn't recommend medication yet. She wanted to try therapy first. She referred us to a therapist who worked on a sliding scale. We started going weekly. It's been expensive, and I've had to cut back on other things, but it's been worth it. In therapy, Tommy started opening up about things he'd never told me. He said after the mugging, he'd been scared all the time. Scared something would happen to me again. Scared he wouldn't be able to stop it. Training helped him feel less scared, but then it became something else. It became the only way he knew how to feel safe. When the thing with Carter happened, it gave him a purpose. He could protect someone. He could be useful. And when Carter asked him to back off, it felt like losing that purpose. The therapist worked with him on separating his identity from being a protector. She helped him see that his worth wasn't tied to whether he could physically defend someone. At school, things changed gradually. Mrs. Kelly set up a peer mediation program, and Carter and Tommy both joined. It gave Tommy a way to help that didn't involve physical intervention. He took to it. Ethan ended up joining the program too. At first, Tommy refused to be in the same sessions as Ethan, but after a few weeks, he agreed to try. The mediator had them work through what had happened. Ethan apologized again, this time more thoroughly. He explained that he'd been dealing with his own stuff at home and had taken it out on Carter, because Carter was an easy target. Tommy didn't forgive him right away, but he listened. By winter break, Tommy and Ethan weren't friends, but they could exist in the same room without tension. Carter had actually started talking to Ethan occasionally. Tommy struggled with that at first. He saw it as a betrayal, but his therapist helped him understand that Carter was allowed to make his own choices about who he forgave. The jiu-jitsu training became less central to Tommy's life. He still goes, but he's not as intense about it. Rick noticed the shift and told me he thought it was healthy. He said Tommy had been starting to approach training like it was preparation for war. And that's not what martial arts should be for kids. Tommy made a couple of other friends this school year, A kid named Jordan who's into the same video games Tommy likes. A girl named Alicia who sits next to him in science class. He's not as isolated as he was. Carter and Tommy are still best friends, but it's different now. Less codependent. They hang out with other kids too. They don't need to be together every second. Last week, Tommy told me something that surprised me. He said he'd been thinking about the fight with Ethan a lot lately. He said he used to feel proud of it, like he'd done something important, but now he just felt tired when he thought about it. I asked what changed. He said he didn't know exactly. Maybe just that he'd realized fighting wasn't the answer he'd thought it was. It didn't fix anything. It just made everything more complicated. I asked if he regretted standing up for Carter. He said no. He'd do it again if he had to, but he wished it hadn't come to that. He wished the adults had done their jobs, so he didn't have to. I told him that was fair. Tommy's relationship with his dad is still basically non-existent. Ronald called it Christmas. They talked for 10 minutes. It was awkward. Tommy doesn't bring him up anymore. Mrs. Patterson retired at the end of last semester. The new homeroom teacher, Mr. Gonzalez, is younger and seems more attentive to what's going on with the kids. Tommy likes him. Beth and Jacob are still good friends of mine. Our families get together every couple of weeks. Carter is doing well. He's still very much himself, still expressive, still confident in who he is. He joined the drama club this year and is thriving. As for me, I'm managing. Work is stable. Money is tight because of the therapy costs, but we're making it work. I still do jujitsu once a week, mostly for myself now rather than for Tommy. Tommy turns 11 next month. When I look at him now compared to a year ago, he seems older. Not in a bad way. Just more aware of how complicated things are. I don't know if I handled everything right. I still wonder sometimes if I should have done things differently. But Tommy seems okay. Not perfect, but okay. And maybe that's the best any of us can hope for.